And cheers emanated from the House floor as President Donald Trump addressed a joint session of Congress, the first of his second term. Some Democratic women showed up in pink as a sign of protest. Other Democrats held up signs. The president touted his mass deportations, taking shots at Democrats. Prior to the address, Republican Tom McClintock had reinforced his support for the president's stance on immigration. U.S. Rep. Jim Costa said the president's efforts to focus on mass deportation is not a solution to fixing a broken immigration solution nor improving border security. Other lawmakers continue to speak against some of President Trump's policies.
The president said he had a mandate, and I was making it clear to the president that he has no mandate to cut Medicaid. I have people who are very fearful. These are poor people, and they have only Medicaid in their lives when it comes to their health care. And I want him to know that his budget calls for deep cuts in Medicaid. He needs to save Medicaid, protect it. We need to raise the cap on Social Security. There's a possibility that it's going to be hurt, and we've got to protect Medicare. These are the safety net programs that people in my congressional district depend on. And this president seems to care less about them and more about the number of people that he can remove from the various programs that have been so helpful to so many people.
I do not speak for anybody but Maxine Waters, and I've been speaking about this president not just now, but when he first ran for office. If you can recall, I told everybody what he was like and that he was going to be divisive, and he's more than divisive. He's hurting this country. He has been bought and paid for by Elon Musk, and the two of them together want to be dictators. I absolutely will not be there.
Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said the U.S. President Donald Trump is appeasing Russia while launching a trade war against Canada. In a blunt news conference during his final days in office, Justin Trudeau said that Canada would plaster retaliatory tariffs on more than $100 billion of American goods in response to the 25% tariffs. Meanwhile, President Trump pushed even further in a post informing Prime Minister Trudeau that when he puts on a retaliatory tariff on the U.S., there will be a reciprocal tariff by a like amount.
The United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. At the same time, they're talking about working positively with Russia, appeasing Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator. Make that make sense. Canadians are reasonable, and we are polite, but we will not back down from a fight. Not when our country and the well-being of everyone in it is at stake. Now, it's not in my habit to agree with the Wall Street Journal, but Donald, they point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do.
Now, for insider perspective of recent activities and, of course, reaction to President Trump's joint session of Congress, White House correspondent, Voice of America, Anita Powell, joins me from the U.S. Thank you for joining us, Anita.
Good morning, Precious. It's an honor to be with you.
So I've seen polls, especially from CBS and YouGov, Americans reacting to that speech, some in favor, some not so much. But let me get your insider information. How are Americans reacting to that speech, especially the talk about an adjustment period because of tariffs?
Right. Okay. So the polls are just rolling in right now, and we're seeing that Americans do approve more than we're hearing here in the Washington bubble of the activities of DOGE, that's the Department of Government Efficiency, to streamline the government. However, they do have, according to the same poll, a negative opinion of the man at the head of DOGE. That would be Elon Musk, the American, South African, Canadian, who is running this operation. So Americans remain deeply divided. You heard from those two Congress people just now, including Al Green of Texas, who was the first congressman in recent memory who I recall who was booted from the speech. There he is on stage right now, on camera right now, rather. And he was booted for shouting during the early minutes of the speech about Medicaid cuts. So there's very deeply divided opinion among Americans this morning as we wake up in the aftermath of what was a historically long and expansive speech where Donald Trump hammered at his domestic agenda and also at his foreign policy agenda, and also revealed a little bit of news with that Ukraine nugget that you mentioned, that Zelensky says he's ready to come to the table for this possible minerals deal, which at this stage, I just want to emphasize, is very vague. So a lot of reaction coming in. There's just a lot to cover this morning. It was a very expansive speech. So we shouldn't expect anybody to be aligned very neatly because there's so many topics that he covered that Americans feel very strongly about.
And I'll get to Al Green in just a moment because we see that Democrats also disapprove of how he chose to protest. But I wanted to stay on the adjustment period. And now that he seems to be enjoying, some level of approval, especially for that speech, how long do you think he will enjoy that approval if Americans, especially his supporters, have to pay more for things like egg and gas?
Sure. Well, what's important to note is that he did bring up just briefly the cost of eggs in the United States, and that hasn't meaningfully come down since he took office 44 days ago. I think it was 44 days ago. It's been a very, very rushed 6 weeks in office. There's been a lot of activity, so it's about 40-something days. But Americans are feeling pretty all over the place about the economic changes that he promised as part of his campaign, but has yet to deliver. And he kind of passed over those a little bit. And yeah, it's been an interesting adjustment period. He's been a very, very active proponent of his policies, signing many executive orders since he came into office on January 20th. And last night, he suggested that some of those executive orders that he signed, particularly on immigration enforcement and also on gender identity, that he would seek to make those laws with the current Republican-controlled House and Congress. But what's really important right now, just looking ahead, we have about 9 days until the U.S. Congress has to pass a continuing resolution for the budget. And he was speaking last night to a room full of those people, legislators who hold the power of the purse in the United States, who are ultimately going to have the power as a co-equal branch of government to decide whether to implement these policies or not. And that's going to be a big, you could say fight. That's going to be a big argument on the Hill in the coming weeks. And this speech really set the stage for that. And
it looks like that fight is going to be on the side of Democrats because he did enjoy, uniform applause and support from Republican congressmen. Not one of them was against anything he said yesterday. That attitude and subtle protest of the Democrats that saw Al Green being removed, from the floor, does that signal to how out of touch Democrats are, or how deeply polarized the country now is?
Well, I would just note that the most important sign of agreement or disagreement is not in those Democrats who you showed who were disagreeing vehemently with the president. It's down to the cold vote numbers. And what's very important right now is that the Republicans do have majorities in the House and the Senate, but they are narrow, slim majorities. And if they want to push anything through, especially some of these divisive cuts, enshrining DOGE moves into law, they're going to face stiff opposition. And at the end of the day, if a bill is defeated, it doesn't really matter whether it's by a wide margin or a narrow one. It just doesn't go through. And so the Democrats understand that they have this obstructive power in their hands right now, but that it's going to be an interesting few weeks right now on Capitol Hill as they work through that. But this Democratic opposition is notable because it is reflected in the House and the Senate, where this very slim minority is up against a slim majority. So there is going to be a lot of push and pull, and it's going to come down to those votes of those several hundred Americans, not the 330 million Americans who voted in the presidential election.
Eventually, towards the end of his speech, he got to his foreign policy agenda. And just to look at that broadly, we've seen him pivoting more to Russia in comparison to President Biden, who did pivot to Europe. And then he also again talked about how he was going to take Panama Canal and Greenland, no matter what it takes. And then we just also heard Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, talking about how he's trying to appease Russia. The foreign policy seems to be all over the place. But what does this mean for Americans and how Americans reacting to it?
As I said, there are many issues, and some Americans feel strongly about one or the other. And also, as you noted, this is a remarkable rhetorical shift from President Biden in terms of Ukraine policy. It's been described as a 180 and as being way more sympathetic to Russia than Biden ever was. Americans, again, have mixed feelings. This is a pluralist nation. Some Americans, of course, are more interested in the immigration enforcement and the tariffs issue. And some, of course, are more interested in foreign policy. And these are, he spanned the globe in his quick précis of foreign policy. He talked about Ukraine, he talked about the Panama Canal and Greenland, and he talked about, just briefly, he touched on the Middle East. He also threw in a few mentions of Africa, but they were scattered and not really connected into any cohesive argument on the continent. But there are just so many issues there that it's pretty natural that Americans are not all going to be necessarily aligned. That's the beauty of the United States. This is a free country, and voters are free to express their opinions, both in public and at the ballot box. And that's what they did in November. That's what they'll do in the midterm elections. And that's what they will continue to do in the halls of Congress as Congress people, in the streets of America, and wherever they feel comfortable, expressing their opinion. But there's just a wide range. And we're kind of sifting through that this morning.
Yeah, you're right. You didn't mention, Africa, Lesotho in particular, and talked about Lesotho as a country that no one has ever heard of, which, was quite shocking because a lot of people around the world know Lesotho. Thank you so much for your time, Anita Powell, White House correspondent for.
That was my favorite moment of the speech because he said Lesotho, which most Americans might pronounce as Lesotho, right? Of course, I've been to Lesotho many times. It's a beautiful country in southern Africa.
Absolutely.
But I love that he said Lesotho that no one has ever heard of. And I kind of wanted to be like, well, you clearly have because you pronounced it correctly. So it was an interesting.
He has, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Anita Powell, White House correspondent for the Voice of America. Pleasure to have you on.
Likewise.